Centuries ago, behind the thick stone walls of gilded palaces, far from the applause of parades and the roaring approval of courtly assemblies, there were children born into crowns and crests, who would never wear them, children whose existence was considered too dangerous, too shameful, or simply too different to be allowed into the light. They came into this world, not with scandal, not with crime, but with something far more feared, a quiet, inherited vulnerability. They had almond-shaped eyes and soft faces. They struggled with words, walked differently, learned at their own pace, and for all of this, things that in any loving home today would be met with compassion, they were locked away, erased from records, and remembered only as cautionary whispers behind velvet curtains. These were royal children born with Down syndrome, a condition now understood as a chromosomal difference, but once interpreted as a divine punishment, a curse upon the bloodline, or worse, a threat to dynastic legitimacy. Their births were rarely announced, their names seldom recorded in family trees. In some cases, they were declared dead while still breathing. In others, they were sent away to institutions, remote estates, or convents, never to be seen in public again. Their photographs were hidden, their faces deliberately excluded from portraits and commemorative artwork. In a world obsessed with perfection, especially royal perfection, they were anomalies to be corrected, concealed, or erased. This is not a story of just one country or one family. It is a pattern that rippled across monarchies and empires, from the stiff protocols of the British Crown to the militaristic traditions of the Prussian court, and into the private homes of the most powerful leaders in modern Europe. These children, many of whom never had the chance to speak for themselves, they were victims not only of misunderstanding, but of a system that saw disability as disgrace. And while the world today is slowly waking up to inclusion, to visibility, to the idea that human worth is not measured by ability, these old stories remain largely buried. Until now, what if you were told that two cousins of Queen Elizabeth II, living in the heart of the 20th century, were institutionalized and declared deceased in official records, though they were very much alive? What if you learned that a Prussian princess, though kept at home and loved, was still excluded from every royal engagement and hidden from the public eye? What if even a daughter of one of Europe's most respected leaders, Charles de Gaulle, was largely unseen by the world during her short life, despite being dearly loved by her parents? What binds all these stories is not just the genetic condition these children shared, but the deep discomfort they stirred in a world that demanded flawlessness from its elite and punished those who dared to defy it. In this series, we will open doors that history tried to keep shut. We will speak names that were silenced. We will look into the eyes of children history erased. And we will remember them not as footnotes of shame, but as fully human beings who lived, who felt, who deserved to be held in the arms of their families and seen by the world. Their stories are not just historical oddities, they are mirrors. Mirrors reflecting how society treats those it deems less than. And though these children were born into privilege, power, and palaces, they were not protected from neglect or abandonment. In fact, their high birth often made their suffering even more invisible, because what mattered most was the throne, not the child. As we begin this journey, it's important to understand how deeply the concept of royal perfection shaped these tragic fates. Monarchies were not just about governance, they were mythological machines. Kings and queens were believed to be chosen by divine right, vessels of purity, discipline, and strength. Every heir represented a future, a continuation of that sacred line. A child who could not rule, could not speak clearly, or struggled to learn, was seen not just as a personal misfortune, but a national threat. An embarrassment that could call into question the legitimacy of the entire family. And so, in palace, corridors adorned with gold, the tiniest hint of imperfection was often met with swift, silent removal. Down syndrome, as we now know, is caused by an extra copy of chromosome 21. It is not a disease, not a punishment, not a curse. It is a natural genetic variation that occurs in all societies, all races, all social classes. Individuals with Down syndrome can experience challenges with learning and health, but also bring immense joy, creativity, and depth of emotion to their communities. In the 21st century, many go on to build careers, relationships, and lives full of meaning. But in the centuries before genetic science, before inclusive education, before the disability rights movement, such children were viewed through a lens of fear and misunderstanding. They were not seen as different, they were seen as defective. And for royal families who relied on appearances to maintain their grip on power, difference was intolerable. In the next part of this series, we will go back in time, not just to the 20th century, but much further to examine how society's earliest views on disability were shaped by superstition, religion, and brutal hierarchy. We'll explore how a child with intellectual or physical differences was interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure, how myths of purity of blood became tools of control, and how even the whispers of difference could jeopardize a kingdom. You will see how fear of disability took root deep in Europe's royal foundations, and how those roots twisted into cruelty, abandonment, and secrecy. Before we tell the stories of Nerissa and Katherine, before we meet Princess Alexandrine or Anne de Gaulle, we must first understand the cultural soil into which they were born. Because their fate was not written in their DNA, it was written in the belief systems that surrounded them. And it is only by tracing those beliefs back to their source that we can begin to see just how far we've come and how far we still have to go. These stories are not easy to hear. They are not the fairy tales of golden crowns and glass slippers. They are quiet tragedies, hidden behind painted ceilings and polished titles. But they are real. They matter. And in telling them, we do what history could not. We make these children visible. We give them back their names, their dignity, and their place in the human story. So, close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. A child is born into royalty. Outside. Bells ring, and courtiers await the official announcement. But inside, the midwife's face tightens. The physician whispers to the Queen Mother, there is hesitation. A decision must be made. And so, instead of celebration, there is silence. Instead of a name, there is a blank space. The child is carried not to a nursery, but to a carriage bound for somewhere else. Somewhere far from the palace, far from the portrait halls, far from history. And the door closes. Now imagine that door opening again centuries later with us, long before genetics became a field of study, before chromosomes had names or microscopes could peer into the delicate blueprint of life. Difference was not something to be explained, it was something to be feared. Across the ancient courts of Europe, from candlelit chambers in Westminster to the frostbitten halls of St. Petersburg, a single glance at a newborn's eyes, posture, or behavior could stir quiet panic behind the smiles of royal attendants. In a world where power was believed to be divinely bestowed, the birth of a child with visible or intellectual differences did not just trigger personal grief, it provoked existential dread. For centuries, disability was not seen through a medical lens, but a spiritual one. A child born imperfect was interpreted by many as a sign of divine punishment, a wrathful message from God, sent to remind a royal family of some sin they had tried to bury. In some corners of the medieval world, Mothers blamed themselves. Fathers turned to priests. Superstition clung like ivy to every cradle. If the child had difficulty speaking, it was said that their soul was not fully human. If they could not walk upright, it was whispered that demons held their legs. If they laughed at odd times or stared into nothing, it was feared they were touched by something dark, something unholy. In courts where even a twitch or stammer could be scrutinized, a child with Down syndrome might have been seen as an omen, a message not to be loved, but to be hidden. Royal families, ever obsessed with control, found themselves vulnerable to something they could neither predict nor command. They could conquer kingdoms and silence rivals, but they could not prevent the birth of a child who defied the illusion of genetic purity. And so, over time, a practice emerged quiet, methodical, and ruthlessly consistent. These children were not acknowledged. Their names were not spoken. If they survived infancy, they were sometimes taken in the night to distant estates, where they would be raised by caretakers under assumed identities. Others were sent to monasteries, institutions, or religious homes, where the vow of silence was not just spiritual, it was strategic. This was especially true during the late medieval and early modern periods. When legitimacy was everything, monarchs claimed their crowns not only through lineage but through performance, the pageantry of divine favor. To suggest that the bloodline had produced a child who did not fit the mold of strength, intellect, or grace was to suggest that the entire foundation of their power might be flawed. And so, out of fear, not just of shame, but of political collapse, they crafted an unspoken code. Perfection must be performed at all costs. Difference must disappear. In the absence of medicine, stories filled the void. In France, it was said that the soul of a defective child had not been properly cleansed. In Russia, some believed that such children had been cursed by forest spirits. In Italy, whispers of witches and maternal sin followed noble women whose children were touched. And in England, where the Bible was interpreted rigidly under Tudor and Stuart rule, disability could be cast as evidence of unconfessed guilt or impurity in the womb. These were not isolated beliefs. They were woven into the very fabric of society, reinforced by religious leaders, court physicians, and royal advisors who understood that preserving image was sometimes more important than preserving life. And what of the children? The historical records are scarce, and that silence is its own answer. Royal archives, memoir, and letters make only the vaguest of references. The child did not survive. They might write, or a private matter was handled. Some journals speak of frailty or illness of the mind, but rarely give names, and never give faces. Historians today believe that many of these children were in fact alive hidden, renamed, or erased. Occasionally, their existence surfaces centuries later through scattered letters, altered portrait, or whispered family legends, but the majority have vanished completely from the public story. Their lives were never meant to be remembered, only absorbed into the myths of flawless succession. Yet behind the gilded myths were real families, real mothers and fathers, some of whom must have grieved deeply, even if they never said so. A queen who birthed a son she could not raise may have stood before a mirror each morning, wondering what kind of life he was living, in a stone convent far away. A king who never spoke of his other child may have paused longer at the nursery door, staring at the cradle that was moved too quickly out of sight. And perhaps some of these rulers, however flawed, carried with them a buried sorrow, a quiet regret that all their power could not buy them the right to hold their own child in public. Of course, not all monarchs reacted with cruelty. There are rare but poignant stories of nobles who defied expectations, who kept their children close despite the whispers, who refused to hide them away. But those stories are exceptions, and they often come from the modern era. When scientific understanding began to challenge superstition, before the 20th century, disability was not treated as a condition, it was treated as a blemish. Not just on the child, but on the dynasty. And so the royal courts, so preoccupied with the dance of diplomacy, lineage, and legacy, turned a blind eye, not out of hatred, always, but out of fear. Fear that the illusion would crack. Fear that rivals would seize upon a child's difference as proof of weakness. Fear that the people, already prone to rebellion, might question whether their rulers were truly favored by God. In this theater of perfection, there was no room for human variation, only roles to play and masks to wear. The tragedy of this era is not only what happened to the children, but how little we know of them. Their names were not inscribed on monuments. Their faces were not painted in oil beside their siblings. Their stories were not told in the grand halls of power. But they existed. They breathed. They laughed, cried, struggled, and loved in the corners of a world that refused to look at them. And the shame was never theirs, it was society's. As we move forward in this series, we will begin to place names and faces into this silence. In the next part, we will step into the 20th century, a time when monarchy still held immense symbolic power. But when secrets began to leak, we will meet Nerissa and Katherine Bowes-Lyon, the quiet cousins of Queen Elizabeth II, whose lives were buried under lies and shame, declared dead in official records while still alive. These women would spend their lives inside the walls of an institution, unseen and rarely visited. Their story will mark the first fracture in the veil, a moment when the public began to ask what exactly royalty was hiding. But before we turn that page, let us hold one final image in our minds, a royal seal pressed into wax on a birth announcement that would never be sent. A family crest carved into stone above a doorway that a child would never walk through. A lullaby sung by a nurse, whose face we will never know. To a baby whose name was lost to time not because they were unloved, but because they were inconvenient. And that, perhaps, is the most painful curse of all, to be born into a world that knows your name and then chooses to forget it. There are silences that settle over history, like fog, thick, heavy, and seemingly endless. And then, once in a rare while, a hand reaches through, brushing aside the veil, revealing not a scandal or a crime, but something even more unsettling, a forgotten life. Or in this case, two. Their names were Nerissa and Katherine Bowes-Lyon. And for most of the 20th century, they were not spoken aloud in drawing rooms or family trees. They were not mentioned in speeches, nor did their photographs hang on the walls of ancestral estates. And yet, they lived. They breathed the same air as queens and courtiers. They shared blood with the woman who would become the most recognizable monarch on earth. But for decades, they were hidden in plain sight. Sisters erased not by death, but by decision. Nerissa was born in the year 1919. Katherine in 1926. Their lineage was impeccable. They were nieces of the Queen Mother, first cousins of Queen Elizabeth II. They entered the world not as commoners, but as daughters of a proud British aristocratic line. Yet, from an early age, it became clear that both girls exhibited signs of what their time called mental deficiency. Today, we understand these signs differently through the compassionate lens of modern neurodiversity, through the chromosomal clarity of conditions like Down syndrome. But back then, there was no such vocabulary, only judgment, only labels. And in the world of the British elite, labels were dangerous things. The Bowes-Lyon family, like many noble houses of their era, carried within it the weight of image. Their role in the monarchy was not only ceremonial, it was symbolic. They were expected to reflect refinement, poise, intellect, and the silent dignity of tradition. When Nerissa and Katherine failed to develop like their peers, the family made a fateful decision. Rather than keep the girls within the care of relatives or provide tailored support within the home, they were sent away. Not temporarily, not for treatment, but indefinitely. Their destination was the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Redhill, Surrey, a place once described as a sanctuary for those with learning disabilities, but one that, by mid-century, had become more associated with neglect, isolation, and the quiet forgetting of inconvenient people, and so, behind institutional walls, the sisters grew. They learned to live not in drawing rooms or rose gardens, but in shared dormitories, among strangers. They did not receive private tutors, but institutional caregivers. The lilt of chamber music was replaced by the buzz of fluorescent lights and the scraping of meal trays. And as the world outside transformed through war, through coronations, through space travel and social change, they remained behind locked doors, their names slowly slipping from memory. But what makes this story unbearably heavy is not merely the fact that they were institutionalized, it is that their very existence was actively denied. In editions of Burke's Peerage, the aristocratic directory considered the genealogical gospel of the British upper class. Both Nerissa and Katherine were officially listed as deceased, not missing, not institutionalized, not even ill, dead. And this falsification remained unchallenged for decades. It was as though the family, or those managing their public record, had decided that absence was not enough. Oblivion must be formalized. Nerissa died in the year 1986. At the time of her death, reports claim she had only a handful of personal possessions and had received almost no visits from her family in years. Her grave, when first discovered by reporters, was marked not by a headstone engraved with her full name and noble lineage, but by a small plastic tag. Katherine lived far longer until the year 2014, but her life followed the same isolated arc. Very few people outside the institution even knew who she was. Her connection to the monarchy was buried under layers of silence. When the story finally surfaced in the late 1980s, it struck the British public like a cold wind through a cracked window. Newspapers carried the tale of the hidden cousins. Headlines questioned the compassion of the royal family. Journalists stood outside the institution's gate, asking questions. No one seemed eager to answer. Some defenders argued that the family had done what they believed best at the time. Others, more critical, called it a betrayal of blood, a stain on the image of a monarchy that had so often emphasized the importance of duty and family. But above all, the story raised a larger, more painful question. What does a society do with those who do not fit its image of perfection for the Bowes-Lyon sisters? The answer had been clear. You do not include them. You do not acknowledge them. You make them disappear. But in that disappearance, something else was lost. Something deeper than ceremony or heritage. By hiding these women, by stripping them of their names and their presence in family trees, their caretakers robbed them of a basic human right, the right to be known. Not known as symbols, not as footnotes, but as people, as daughters, as sisters, as cousins, as individuals who have their own internal worlds, their own thoughts and rhythms and quiet joys. Perhaps Nerissa loved the feel of morning light through a barred window. Perhaps Katherine found peace in music or colour, or the scent of gardens during weekly walks. We will never know what made them laugh. We will never know what made them afraid. We were not meant to know, but now we do. Their story broke through not because someone wanted it told, but because it could no longer be kept buried. In this way, They became accidental heroines, silent witnesses to the cost of shame. They stood, even in death, as reminders that secrecy is not protection. And that image, no matter how carefully curated, should never come at the expense of a child's humanity. In the next part of this series, we will look beyond Britain. We will travel eastward to meet Princess Alexandrine of Prussia, born in the early 20th century, whose fate was gentler, but no less shaped by the quiet rules of royal protocol. She was not locked away in an institution. She was allowed to stay with her family. She appeared, very occasionally, in photographs, and yet, the message remained. You may be loved, but not publicly. You may exist, but not as part of the monarchy's face to the world. Hers is a story of love constrained by fear, of visibility limited by reputation, of a life lived between acceptance and exile. But for now, let us hold Nerissa and Katherine in our thoughts, not as symbols of cruelty, nor as objects of pity, but as people. As two young girls who entered the world full of the same potential for wonder and connection as anyone else, their greatest fault was not their condition. It was being born into a family that could not see past it. They deserved more. They deserved to be seen. There is a particular kind of sadness that lingers not in absence but in presence. Without acknowledgement, a life lived in the soft twilight of family circles. Always nearby, yet never fully included. Always cared for, yet never truly counted. Such was the world of Princess Alexandrine of Prussia. Born in the year 1915 into the storied House of Hohenzollern, the ruling dynasty that had once shaped empires, commanded armies, and forged the destiny of Central Europe. Her father, Crown Prince Wilhelm, stood at the heart of Germany's monarchy in the final decades before the world changed irrevocably, and her family carried with them the remnants of imperial grandeur long after thrones had been dismantled and crowns placed behind glass. Into this lineage of power and military discipline, Alexandrine arrived, not with a cry of triumph, but with quiet difference. From early on, it became apparent that Alexandrine was not like other royal children. Her speech came slowly. Her gaze wandered differently. Her responses were gentle and delayed. And though she smiled, there was something in her rhythm of being that defied the swift expectations of the court. While the world lacked the modern language of diagnosis, many historians now believe she was born with Down syndrome, though at the time such a term would have held little meaning and even less mercy. Yet what separates Alexandrine's story from so many others of her kind is that she was not sent away. She was not institutionalized, nor declared dead on paper. Her family, whether out of affection, principle, or quiet rebellion against courtly norms, made a different choice. They kept her close. She lived not in a hospital, but within the family estate. She was present at some gatherings. She appeared in select family photographs. And her image, though often off to the side, exists in commemorative postcards from an era desperate to preserve its fading nobility. And though she never held court or took part in official functions, Alexandrine was never entirely removed. She was visible but only just, a tolerated shadow on the edge of dynastic memory, permitted to remain but never celebrated. The message was clear: you may be loved, but your love must be quiet. You may belong, but only in private. You may smile for the camera, but no one will ask your name. Her family was by the accounts available, kind to her. She was not shunned within the walls of her home, and she attended a special school where her days were structured gently. She was sheltered from ridicule, protected from political winds, and allowed to grow without public spectacle. But even in this comparative comfort, the lines were carefully drawn. Alexandrine would never marry. Never speak on behalf of the royal house. Never step into the ceremonial roles afforded to other princesses. Her presence was treated not as a scandal, but as a soft exception, a deviation that could be handled so long as it remained discreet. She became something like an open secret, acknowledged only when silence became impolite. And so she lived quietly, steadily, behind embroidered curtains and the polished windows of estates whose grandeur outlived their purpose. When she passed away in the year 1980, a few outside noble circles noticed. Her life did not spark public outrage, nor was it unearthed by journalists. There were no false death records, no plastic grave markers, but there was also no legacy, no voice, no lasting imprint on the history books. Alexandrine did not disappear, but she was never truly seen. Hers is a story that illustrates the insidious nature of polite exclusion, of how a life can be neither shamed nor honored, but gently folded into a drawer that no one opens. The tragedy of Alexandrine is not one of cruelty, it is one of quiet compliance. It shows us what happens when families choose compassion without courage, affection without acknowledgement, protection without pride. It reveals a kind of love that fears the gaze of others more than it fears erasure. And perhaps it also speaks to the slow thawing of societal norms, a moment in history where rejection began to soften into toleration, even if it had not yet reached true acceptance. Alexandrine was not locked away, but she was not brought forward. She was a daughter, both loved and hidden, a princess behind the curtain. In the next part of our series, we will cross the line between monarchy and modern political power, stepping into the home of Charles de Gaulle, leader of Free France, father of a nation, and the unlikely parent of a girl with Down syndrome. Unlike the royal families before him, de Gaulle would refuse silence. He would not send his daughter away, and yet, even in his remarkable tenderness, the pressures of image and position would still shape how the world saw and didn't see Anne de Gaulle. Her story will mark a turning point in this long journey, not only because of the choices her parents made, but because of what they left behind in her name. But before we go there, let us pause with Alexandrine not as a footnote in Prussian decline, but as a young woman who lived a full span of years, whose presence challenged the cold codes of royal decorum, and whose memory lingers in the faded corners of family albums. She was not hidden in darkness, but neither was she brought into the light. And somewhere in that in-between space, in that filtered sunlight of semi-recognition, she remains waiting, perhaps, to be more fully remembered. There are moments in history when the expected roles of power shift, if only for a heartbeat, and the general becomes the father, the statesman becomes the mourner, and the icon becomes deeply, achingly human. Such was the transformation witnessed quietly, privately in the life of Charles de Gaulle, the towering French leader known for his stern demeanor, his unshakable nationalism, and the profound gravity of his public speeches. But beneath the polished brass of military accolades and the sharp contours of national strategy lived a tender and wholly unpublicized devotion, that of a father to a daughter named Anne, a child born not for the spotlight of triumph, but for the silent classroom of compassion, a child who, in the eyes of many at the time, bore a flaw so unacceptable that it might have doomed the careers and crowns of less courageous men. Anne de Gaulle was born in the year 1928, into a France still finding its shape after the tremors of the Great War, still unsure of the moral terrain it would need to navigate before it could face the fires of the next great conflict. From the beginning, Anne struggled to meet the developmental milestones expected of a general's daughter, and while medicine at the time lacked the language and tools we now possess, it soon became clear that she had Down syndrome, a condition still poorly understood, often feared, and frequently hidden behind the walls of asylums and institutions. But in a profound and deeply human decision, Charles and his wife, Yvonne, chose a different path. They chose not exile, not institutionalization, not shame or silence. They chose to raise Anne at home, to love her openly, to make her part of the daily rhythm of their family life, even if the rest of the world could not fully understand. While many leaders of his stature and generation might have seen a child like Anne as a weakness to be managed or obscured, Charles de Gaulle instead embraced her as a source of strength, a moral compass in a world of shifting allegiances and complex betrayals. He, who would one day stand before France as a symbol of unyielding resolve, knelt gently to feed his daughter, helped her dress, laughed at her simple joys, and grieved her frustrations with the patience of a man who understood that love, in its purest form, expects nothing in return. Those who witnessed them together spoke of a tenderness rare in men of his rank, a softness that bloomed only in her presence. To the world, he was granite. To her, he was warmth. But even this act of radical love did not fully escape the restraints of the time. Anne, though raised within the de Gaulle household, remained largely invisible to the public. She did not attend official functions, was not photographed during state events, and her condition was never openly discussed in speeches or interviews. The media, adhering to the unspoken rules of the era, made no mention of her. There was no scandal because there was no narrative, only silence. The public did not know her name. The nation did not know its general had a daughter who could not speak clearly, could not follow conventional education, who danced when others walked and sang when others whispered. And yet, in the quiet spaces of their home, she was the heart of the family. Anne loved music, it is said, and found joy in color, in touch, in repetition. Her world was a different tempo, one that the general used to order, and hierarchy learned to follow with humility. He did not seek to change her. He changed himself. In moments when the burdens of leading a nation into exile, into war, into eventual liberation, weighed heavy on his shoulders, it was to Anne's presence he often returned her laughter, a balm, her touch, a grounding. And in this reversal of roles, where the daughter, with a so-called deficiency, taught the father something about patience, simplicity, and unconditional love, a quiet revolution unfolded not in policy, but in perception. When Anne fell ill with pneumonia in the winter of 1948, there was no state bulletin, no grand public concern, no parade of headlines. She was not a public figure. She was a daughter, and when she passed away shortly thereafter, at the tender age of 20, the sorrow that overtook Charles de Gaulle was not the ceremonial grief of a leader, it was the raw, unraveling ache of a man who had lost his reason for gentleness. Those closest to him recounted that he wept, openly and without reservation, for perhaps the only time in his adult life. For a man trained to steel his emotions in the face of military defeat and political betrayal, it was Anne's passing that dismantled his walls most completely. He buried her in Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, the quiet village that would later become his own final resting place. Her tombstone is simple, un adorned, and in stark contrast to the monuments built to commemorate the grandeur of French history. It reads, simply, Anne de Gaulle, born and died with love. There are no titles, no mentions of her condition, no national symbolism, just love. But her story did not end there. Out of grief, Yvonne de Gaulle transformed sorrow into service, founding the Fondation Anne de Gaulle, a home dedicated to the care and dignity of children with disabilities, a place where other Annes could be seen, supported, and embraced rather than hidden. Through this act, Anne's legacy extended far beyond the quiet rooms of her childhood. Her name, once unknown to the public, became a banner under which empathy could march. Anne's life marked a pivot in the long, painful narrative of how society, especially its most powerful institutions, treats those who do not conform to its expectations of ability, intellect, and image. She was not erased like Nerissa and Katherine. She was not quietly sidelined like Alexandrine. She was embraced, cherished, and mourned without apology. And yet, even her story carries the echo of caution, the sense that love was possible, but visibility still dangerous. Her father's public silence, even as his private world orbited around her, reminds us how deep the conditioning of shame and decorum ran, even in the hearts of good men. As we look ahead to the final parts of this journey, we begin to understand that these stories, though deeply personal, are not isolated. They form a chain of inherited silence, passed down through bloodlines and reinforced by fear, the fear of being seen as weak, the fear of challenging tradition, the fear that compassion might be mistaken for vulnerability. But in Anne's story, we see the first fractures in that chain. We see a man who, despite his uniform, despite his rank, allowed his child to teach him what no battlefield ever could. That dignity does not come from titles. And legacy is not measured in victories, but in the softness we carry for those who need us most. In the next chapter, we will pull back even further, tracing the deep historical roots of disability in the royal imagination. We will look not just at individual children, but at the systems political, religious, and social that shaped their erasure. We will ask, when did disability become a threat? How did fear override love? And how many stories were buried before we ever learned their names? But before we leave Anne behind, let us sit with her for a while longer. Let us picture the child who clapped at the sound of bells, who found joy in the texture of fabric, who danced in her father's arms. Let us remember that she existed, not as a symbol of sorrow, but as a full and radiant life, however short, and let us honor the man who, beneath the medals and the gravitas, chose love over legacy, at least within the walls of his home. Anne softened a general's heart, and in doing so, she helped open a door the world had long tried to keep closed. There is a particular kind of silence that does not come from forgetfulness, but from intense silence that is built, stone by stone, like a wall to keep out shame, discomfort, and truth. It is the silence of official records left blank, of portraits retouched to exclude a figure, of family memoirs that speak of all the children but one. It is a silence that echoes in grand halls where names were meant to echo but instead fell away, swallowed by protocol and fear. In royal families, where every birth carried political weight and every child symbolized the future of the throne, this silence was not an absence. It was a strategy, and it became, over centuries, not just a recurring action, but a culture, a deep and unspoken understanding that if a child was born different, it was better, safer, cleaner, if they simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. This culture of erasure did not begin in the 20th century, nor was it confined to the well-documented stories of Nerissa, Katherine, Alexandrine, or Anne. Long before there were headlines, before investigative journalists or modern advocacy, there were children born into dynasties who never made it into the family tree, not because they died, but because they lived in ways the world refused to acknowledge. Some of them may have had Down syndrome. Others may have had cerebral palsy, epilepsy, autism, or other conditions poorly understood by medieval and early modern medicine. But what united them all was not their diagnosis, for such labels did not yet exist. What united them was the collective decision by their families, their advisors, and their states to remove them from the visible lineage. They were not mourned. They were edited. In the royal courts of Europe, image was everything. Kings were crowned by God, or so the narrative claimed. Queens were symbols of beauty and fertility. Heirs were raised as living proof of divine favor and continuity. To suggest that the bloodline had produced a child who did not conform, who could not speak clearly, who could not master the courtly dance, who did not learn the rules of nobility as swiftly or precisely as expected, was to suggest that the entire foundation of divine rule might be flawed. And so, quietly, sometimes cruelly, often with devastating calmness, Zouch's children were removed, not always through violence, often through distance. They were sent to distant abbeys, raised by nuns, cared for in obscure estates, and their names were whispered in the same tone as illnesses, something to be kept hidden until it passed, or until it could be buried. The clergy, who played a central role in royal education and morality, often reinforced these choices. Within the theological frameworks of the time, disability was frequently interpreted as punishment, a reflection of sin in the family, or an impurity in the line. Some believed these children were being tested by God, but even then, the test was to be endured in private. Public display of imperfection was not only a political liability, it was spiritual embarrassment. The contradiction was never fully resolved. Monarchs declared themselves chosen by heaven, and yet when heaven gave them a child who did not fit the mold, they quietly looked away. Art and literature of the time reflect this pattern. In tapestries and paintings, royal children are often depicted in symmetry, perfectly postured, dressed in miniature versions of adult finery, eyes forward, hands folded. There are no signs of the clumsy grace of neurodivergence, no visible accommodations for physical difference. And if there were ever sketches or studies that captured the presence of a child with a disability, they were likely discarded or stored away in archives, unexhibited and unpreserved. What was not beautiful by royal standards was not considered worthy of remembrance. But behind this veneer of perfection, stories did unfold, many of them never recorded, others hinted at in correspondence, in household budgets, in medical records, buried deep in national archives. A sudden reference to a governess who left without explanation, a mention of the child who did not recover, an estate that received an unusual stipend for care, a royal midwife whose services were needed far longer than the official birth narrative allowed. These fragments, when gathered together, do not form biographies, but they whisper of lives lived in the shadows of palaces, children who existed within earshot of crowns, but never touched them. It is important to note that this was not merely the cruelty of individual families, it was a system supported by advisors, upheld by societal norms, and enabled by the structures of royal myth-making. In an era when monarchies were under constant threat from rebellion, religious upheaval, or foreign invasion, the appearance of unity and divine favor was considered essential to survival. A child who could not perform royalty was seen not only as a personal tragedy, but as a crack in the fortress wall. And so they were hidden, not out of hatred, but out of fear. But fear, when institutionalized, becomes tradition. And tradition, when unquestioned, becomes cruelty. In some cases, the secrecy went so deep that the child themselves may not have known their true identity. Raised under another name, surrounded by caretakers who were sworn to silence, they may have reached adulthood unaware that they had been born into power. In other cases, they may have known dimly, painfully, that they were not like the others, Not because of their condition, but because of the way people looked at them, spoke to them, moved them from room to room when guests arrived. The shame was never theirs, but they were the ones made to carry it. And still, some parents must have loved deeply. Some mothers surely wept as their infants were taken away, promising to visit, to write, to somehow keep a connection alive. Some fathers may have fought the decision, only to be overruled by councils, by advisors, by the unrelenting logic of monarchy. It would be easy to paint them all as villains, but that would be a simplification. The real villain was the system itself, a system that demanded perfection, rewarded silence, and punished vulnerability with exile. As we move closer to the present day, this culture of erasure began to shift, not because of royal reform, but because society at large began to change. The rise of modern medicine, the development of special education, the advocacy of families, and eventually, the voices of disabled individuals themselves began to pierce the centuries-old silence. And yet, even now, in many countries and among elite families, traces of that silence remain. It lingers in the discomfort with public visibility, in the coded language used to describe difference, in the polished family portraits where no one stims, no one limps, no one looks away. The legacy of this silence is not just historical, it is personal. It lives in the descendants who discover, through research or rumor, that a great-aunt was once placed in a hospital and never spoken of again. It lives in the children of today who are taught to mask their behaviors, to tone themselves down, to fit into spaces that were never designed to include them. And it lives in the archives, boxes of letters unopened, diaries kept locked, documents that might one day reveal the full tapestry of royal families, not as icons of purity, but as deeply human networks of joy and pain, of inclusion and abandonment. In the next part of this series, we will return to specific stories, those of modern royals whose decisions to acknowledge or embrace difference have begun to reshape the narrative. We will see how public figures today grapple with the legacy of secrecy and how the tide, however slowly, has begun to turn toward visibility, empathy, and change. But before we go there, let us acknowledge what has come before, not just the names we know, but the countless we do not. Let us hold a space for the unnamed daughters, the vanished sons, the children whose portraits were never painted, whose birthdays were never announced, whose lives were deemed incompatible with the myth of the throne. They were not weak, they were not broken, they were made invisible, not by nature, but by fear. And now, at last, they are being remembered. There comes a moment in every long-held silence when the air shifts imperceptibly at first, like the faint breeze before a storm, and something unspoken begins to stir. That moment does not come from sudden revolution, but from the quiet accumulation of questions too long ignored. It comes not from the collapse of tradition, but from the slow, steady courage of those willing to look back and ask, why did we accept this for so long? And so it is with the history of how royal families and powerful dynasties have treated children with disabilities, particularly those born with Down syndrome. After centuries of concealment, of whispered shame and strategic forgetting, something began to change, not overnight, not cleanly, but undeniably. The first cracks in the wall were not created by monarchs themselves, but by society beyond the palace gates. The 20th century brought with it a series of transformations that rippled outward from medicine, education, and social activism. With the mapping of human chromosomes in the mid-1900s, science finally gave names to conditions that had long been wrapped in mystery and fear. Down syndrome was no longer seen as a curse. but as a genetic variation caused by an extra copy of chromosome 21. For the first time in history, the language used to describe these children began to shift from moral condemnation to biological understanding. At the same time, a quiet revolution was building within communities. Parents who had once been told to give up their children, to send them away, to forget they had ever existed, began to resist. They formed networks, advocated for special education, demanded rights, and created support systems where none had existed. They published books, founded organizations, and eventually began to shape public policy. In countries like the United States, Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and parts of Scandinavia, the late 20th century saw the passage of legislation aimed at inclusion laws that ensured children with disabilities had the right to attend public schools, access therapy, and receive medical care without stigma. And still, the palaces were slow to respond. Monarchies, by their nature, move cautiously. Bound by centuries of tradition, ceremonial codes, and public scrutiny, they are not built for rapid transformation. Their every gesture is weighed, interpreted, and archived. To break a pattern in such a space requires not only compassion, but courage, the kind of quiet bravery that dares to disrupt a legacy carefully curated over generations. And yet, even within these cautious institutions, a new tone began to emerge. In the early 2000s, journalists and royal biographers began asking more direct questions about the history of hidden children. Why had Nerissa and Katherine been declared dead in the peerage books when they were very much alive? Why had no one visited them for decades? Why had their story only emerged through investigative digging, rather than honest acknowledgement? These questions did not destroy the monarchy, but they did shake its image of compassionate perfection. And in their aftermath, something shifted. In recent years, a number of royal and noble families across Europe have made small but significant gestures toward visibility. While not all involved children with Down syndrome, many of these actions reflected a broader opening, an awareness that disability should no longer be treated as a source of shame. In Sweden, Crown Princess Victoria has been vocal in supporting neurodiverse education and inclusive programs for children with developmental delays. In the Netherlands, Queen Maxima has supported organizations focused on mental health and cognitive disability. And in the United Kingdom, members of the younger royal generation have taken a more public stance on openness, vulnerability, and inclusion, though the legacy of silence still lingers in the spaces they have yet to name. More important than official gestures, however, are the stories emerging from within civil society. Stories of families who once watched from afar as royalty erased children like theirs, and who now feel empowered to share their own. Stories of individuals with Down syndrome who have grown up to become artists, athletes, teachers, business owners, and public speakers. Their lives are not free of struggle, but they are full of presence. They are seen, and being seen, after centuries of invisibility, is no small thing. Perhaps the most powerful change has come, not from royal decrees, but from cultural transformation. In film, literature, and media, characters with disabilities are beginning to appear not as metaphors or burdens, but as full human beings. Documentaries like Forget Me Not and Far From the Tree challenge audiences to confront the deep biases we hold about difference. Campaigns like Nothing Down About It and Don't Diss My Ability have reframed public conversations. And in classrooms across the world, children now learn for the first time in their families' histories that their worth is not measured by how closely they mimic the norm. Yet, even as the pattern begins to break, the shadows of the past still stretch long. There are still families, royal and otherwise, who struggle with the decision to speak openly. There are still countries where institutionalization is the norm, where children with Down syndrome are denied education, or worse, their very lives. There are still cultures where perfection is worshipped more than kindness, where lineage is protected more fiercely than love. The silence has not vanished. It has simply lost its monopoly. In this turning point lies both a warning and a hope. The warning is this: visibility alone is not justice. To speak of a hidden history is only the first step. What must follow is remembrance, not the shallow kind that erects plaques or issues apologies, but the deeper kind that asks how many lives were lost, how many names were never spoken, how many children were left to die in silence. It is not enough to change the narrative going forward. We must reckon with the silence we inherited. We must ask who was missing from the portraits who stood just outside the frame. And yet, there is also hope, because for the first time in history, that frame is expanding. The image of royalty, once so rigid and sanitized, is being complicated. The idea that lineage must mean perfection is losing its hold, and more broadly, the belief that human worth depends on ability is slowly, stubbornly, beautifully being dismantled. The lives of Nerissa and Katherine, of Alexandrine, of Anne, and of countless unnamed children are no longer footnotes. They are stories now told, held, mourned, and remembered. They are no longer invisible. As we prepare to close this series, we will turn in the final part to a question that has lingered beneath every chapter. What does it mean to remember? What does it mean to give dignity to those who are erased? And how can memory itself become an act of restoration? We will look not just at the past, but at what kind of future is possible. One where no child, royal or not, is ever again hidden to preserve an illusion. One where love does not whisper, but speaks. But before we reach that closing chapter, let us pause here, in the space where the pattern begins to crack, where silence gives way to breath, where the doors that were once sealed shut begin, at last, to open. There is a sacred weight in remembrance, a quiet power that flows not from monuments or medals, but from the act of refusing to look away. To remember someone who was deliberately forgotten is to break a pact of silence made long before you arrived. It is to say you mattered, even if the world tried to say you did not. You were here. You laughed. You cried. You breathed. And though your name may never have echoed through palace halls or school registers, though your story may not have been recorded in the lines of official histories, your existence was no less real, no less worthy. In the final part of this journey, we turn toward this act of remembering, not as a sentimental gesture, but as a form of restoration, a way of returning dignity to those from whom it was stolen. When a child is erased, it is not only their voice that disappears, it is the chain of memory that vanishes with them. Siblings grow up without acknowledging their presence. Portraits are painted with spaces too symmetrical. Diaries omit details. Public records lie. And over time, that omission becomes fact, becomes silence, becomes the only version of history anyone knows. But silence, no matter how thickly laid, can be broken. And when it is, the truth that returns is not only painful, it is illuminating. It shows us not just what was lost, but what was possible and never allowed to bloom. The stories we have explored of Nerissa and Katherine, of Alexandrine, of Anne, are now known because someone chose to speak. A journalist asked the right question. A record was discovered. A grave was found. But for every child whose name has been recovered, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds, whose stories remain sealed in locked archives, in fading memories, in the veiled language of family shame, We may never know all their names. We may never trace the full map of this quiet exclusion. But the act of naming even a few is enough to begin the work of collective remembrance. To honor these children is not to wallow in tragedy. It is to bring them into the room, to speak of them not as symbols of suffering, but as human beings with inner lives, with moments of joy and frustration, with habits, preferences, and affections. It is to imagine what they loved, what made them laugh, who they clung to when frightened. It is to believe that their lives, however short, however limited by circumstance, had meaning that transcended their erasure. And in doing so, we begin to dismantle the very logic that allowed their disappearance in the first place. One of the most radical things we can do is to remember without shame, to say their names aloud, to place their photographs beside those of their more celebrated siblings, to include them in genealogies, in family trees, in national histories, to say here is the full truth, not the sanitized one, not the perfected image, but the whole, because it is only in the whole that healing can happen. The longer we pretend that love must look a certain way, that legacy must come free of blemish, that history must be written in symmetry, the longer we continue the same harm that silenced these children in the first place. In remembering, we also make a demand of the present. We say to today's leaders, families, and institutions, do not repeat this. Do not exile a child to protect an image. Do not use silence as a strategy. Do not let fear dictate how much love is shown or how much truth is told. Because remembrance is not passive, it is a commitment. It says we have learned, and we will not go back. But there is another layer to this restoration, one even more intimate. It lives not in the public eye, but in families, those who, for generations, have carried the weight of a missing presence. Perhaps a grandmother who once spoke vaguely of a sibling who did not live long. Perhaps a box of letters never shown to the children. Perhaps a faded photograph tucked in the back of a drawer. Unexplained, unnamed, these echoes are not coincidences. They are traces. And when we trace them, when we choose to investigate rather than suppress, we give our ancestors, both those who were silenced and those who did the silencing, a chance at redemption. Because even those who made the choice to hide may not have done so from cruelty. Often, they were acting within the constraints of a society that gave them no language, no support, no models for what love could look like in the face of difference. Many parents wept in private. Many grandparents visited in secret. Many siblings carried the burden of silence not because they wanted to, but because they thought it was the only way to preserve peace. To remember is not to judge them, it is to release them. To say you did what you could in a world that gave you no better tools. And now we will do better. Institutions, too, are beginning to reckon with this past. Archives are being opened. Medical records are being digitized. Museums and historical societies are creating exhibitions that explore disability, not as a side note, but as a central thread in understanding power, family, and human rights. These efforts are not perfect, and they are not yet widespread. But they mark a beginning, a sign that the narrative is no longer controlled solely by those who once chose to erase. The descendants of those forgotten children are speaking. Advocates are demanding transparency. Artists are reimagining portraits with the missing figures restored. And slowly, the wall of silence is crumbling. There is still much work to do. In many countries, stigma remains. Institutionalization is still common. Children with disabilities are still born into families who feel pressure to hide, to minimize, to separate. But if we look at the arc of history from complete erasure to guarded silence, to partial visibility, and now to open conversation, we can begin to believe that something lasting is changing. Not because the world has suddenly become kind, But because enough people refuse to accept the lie that love requires perfection, as we end this series, we return to the first image, a child born into royalty, whose existence was seen not as a blessing, but as a threat. That child is no longer alone. Through memory, we place others beside them: sisters, cousins, daughters, sons, each with their own light, long buried, but never extinguished. And in the telling of their stories, in the refusal to forget, we begin to restore not just their dignity, but our own. Because when we speak of those who were erased, we do not only honor their lives, we make ourselves more human. We expand the circle of belonging. We declare that love is not reserved for the exceptional, that memory is not the privilege of the powerful, that every child, regardless of condition, capability, or circumstance, deserves to be seen, named, and remembered. And perhaps that is how healing begins, not in fanfare, not in proclamations, but in the quiet insistence that those who were once forgotten will be forgotten no more. Close your eyes for a moment, not in fear, but in gentleness. Let the noise of history fade just enough that you can hear something softer beneath it. Not the thunder of crowns falling, nor the rustle of parchment laws, nor even the distant clamor of parades and pageants, but the sound of a small breath, steady and slow, rising from a cradle pushed into a quiet room. A breath the world once tried not to hear. A breath that remained, regardless. This is where we end, not with outrage or mourning, but with a kind of quiet reverence for the light that was always there, even when no one looked for it. In every part of this journey, from the silence that cloaked Nerissa and Katherine, to the half-visibility of Alexandrine, to the aching tenderness of Anne's story, and through the long corridors of cultural denial that stretched behind every gilded door, we have followed the path of children who were born into power but denied its protection. They were not banished by decree, not denounced in public, they were simply removed from view. Their presence erased not by swords, but by omission. But in these final moments of reflection, we return to them, not as ghosts of the past, but as teachers of the present, because, through their stories, we learn something about ourselves that no dynasty ever intended us to see. We learn that dignity does not require permission, that a life does not need a title to be worthy of memory, that love, when real, is not fragile. It does not fracture under the weight of imperfection. It does not retreat when a child fails to meet expectations. It does not hide, and when it has been hidden, it does not resent being found again. For too long, the world of royalty modeled something else, the performance of perfection, the architecture of ideal lineage, the quiet terror of anything that did not reflect the image they wanted to project. But we are no longer bound to that myth. We have seen what lies behind it, and we have chosen, now, to tell a different story. One in which the child who stims, who rocks, who speaks in patterns only they understand, is not seen as a mistake to be corrected, but as a mystery to be welcomed. One in which lineage is not a wall, but a circle that expands to hold every kind of life, every kind of mind, every kind of heart. And so, in this final reflection, let us imagine again those children not as sidelined figures, but as central ones. Imagine Katherine's fingers trailing across a window pane, watching birds she could never name but always loved. Imagine Alexandrine clapping her hands at a moment no one else understood, her joy breaking the tension of a silent afternoon. Imagine Anne pulling her father's face down toward her own, not with ceremony, but with the directness of a love unfiltered by language. Imagine Nerissa, perhaps in the garden of her institution, feeling sunlight on her face and knowing, even if no one else knew, that she was alive, and that this moment was hers. These are not tragedies. These are sacred truths. In honoring them, we are not only giving back the dignity that was denied, we are reclaiming our own capacity to see clearly, to love deeply, to speak freely, even when the world prefers. We remain quiet. We are remembering that every time a society hides its most vulnerable, it diminishes its strongest. That every time a family chooses silence over presence, the absence echoes louder than truth. And that healing begins not with perfection, but with presence, the willingness to sit with discomfort, to name the unnamed, to draw the forgotten child back into the frame and say, gently, you belong here too. As we prepare to close this story, let it not end with the children alone. Let us remember those who held them anyway, the mothers who wrote letters that were never sent, the nurses who brushed their hair with care, the caretakers who stayed long after their shifts, the archivists who quietly refused to destroy a document, the siblings who kept a photograph hidden in a book, waiting for the day they could show it. Let us remember the small rebellions of love that bloomed even in the soil of silence. And then, let us imagine one last scene, not historical, but timeless. A long corridor of portraits, each painted in royal finery, each one stiff with ceremony, kings with distant gazes, queens with hands folded, children standing still. But now, in that final space on the wall, imagine a new portrait not posed, not polished, but true. A child sitting sideways in a chair, one shoe off, hands mid-clap, mouth half open in a laugh. No medals, no crest. Just light from a nearby window, catching the softness in their face. And beneath the frame, instead of title or lineage, only 4 words: you were always enough. That is the restoration. That is the bedtime truth. And perhaps, as you lay your head down tonight, you'll hear their breath. Those forgotten children who are forgotten no more, rising like a hymn through the silence history tried to leave behind. A breath of presence, a breath of freedom, a breath of love, spoken now in full.